في بالكامية تسيك من التبوع الإسرائيلي بأشير عم تتهم بين حسن مصدوط حكم إسرائيل متبار محكار رجنتي شين عراق مشنات أرباي ومسكرته.
That's the Republican platform. You have to bear in mind, I mean, historically the Republicans aren't the people who get the U.S. into foreign wars.
But we had several of these individuals like Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl who are dual citizens with Israel.
That's right.
Which for years on this radio program, I've pointed this out. How can, here in the United States, how can we appoint to a high-level office in the Pentagon, in the State Department, individuals who have citizenship in another country?
Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azawi. On February 5th, 2003, then U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell presented his country's justification to invade Iraq. He argued that Saddam Hussein had stockpiled weapons of mass destruction and that Iraq had links to Al-Qaeda. But these reasons have not stood up. And today, critics of President Bush accuse him of taking America to war over lies. 5 years after the invasion, there are some who suggest other reasons for the war on Iraq. Some claim it was about establishing democracy. Some say it was about securing oil. And others argue it was to protect Israel. Indeed, for many people here in the Middle East, the war on Iraq is all about oil and Israel. Nadeem Baba reports.
In March, the US president marks the 5th anniversary of the Iraq invasion with a telling reflection.
There's an understandable debate over whether the war was worth fighting, whether the fight is worth winning, and whether we can win it.
It was a far cry from the original justification of grave and gathering danger posed by Saddam Hussein and his supposed stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. Instead, the White House now has a new set of reasons for the war, establishing democracy in the Middle East and fighting terrorists abroad rather than on American soil. But others say the main reason lay under the ground.
Oil is one of the most significant elements in the whole thing, and it is a natural thing to assume that there are other items in the agenda. But oil is the prime thing. Don't forget, the people who are running the U.S. administration now, Bush, Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, they all have oil links, they're oil people. And if oil is not in their thinking, it's definitely in the background.
Some say the invasion has given the U.S. more than just access to some of the world's largest oil fields, namely a unique opportunity to create a permanent presence for forward power projection. President Bush has enjoyed close ties with the Israeli leadership, and by establishing military bases in Iraq, one argument goes, he would ensure that Israel could pursue hardline policies without fear of reprisal. For years to come, historians and analysts will argue over exactly why Saddam Hussein was toppled. Most people here in the Middle East believe the answer lies in controlling oil and empowering Israel. And as hard as President Bush may try to argue otherwise, fewer and fewer people now believe him. Nadeem Baba for Inside Iraq.
To sort out the conflicting reasons,
went in there for control and greater access to Iraq's oil. And Tony Uhas, let's talk about the members of this Iraq study group that might explain what their approach has been, particularly James Baker, the former Secretary of State, and also Lawrence Eagleburger. Talk about the two of them.
What does this foreshadow for our world?
I think it's really scary. I mean, I think that the U.S. government right now is in the midst of its most radical privatization agenda. 70% of the national intelligence budget is farmed out to the private sector. We have more contractors than soldiers occupying Iraq. I think that what this does is it sanitizes it also for the American people. There's not a draft. There's been, almost 4,000 U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq. We don't know how many private contractors, but that's a relatively small number compared to Vietnam, for instance, where we talked about 65,000 body bags coming home.
Somewhere I read
of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest our rights.
Yeah, both Baker and Eagleburger have spent their careers doing one of two things, working for the federal government or working in private enterprise, taking advantage of the work that they did for the federal government. So in particular in this case, both Baker and Eagleburger were key participants throughout the 80s and early 1990s of radically expanding U.S. economic engagement with Saddam Hussein with the very clear objective of gaining greater access for U.S. corporations, particularly oil corporations, to Iraq's oil, and doing everything that they could to expand that access. Baker has his own private interests. His family is heavily invested in the oil industry, and also Baker Botts, his law firm, is one of the key law firms representing oil companies across the United States and their activities in the Middle East. And Lawrence Eagleburger was president of Kissinger Associates, which was one of the leading multinational advising firms for advising U.S. companies who are trying to get contracts with Saddam Hussein and get work in Iraq. Now, these two members of the Iraq Study Group are joined by two additional members who are representatives of the Heritage Foundation, and the Heritage Foundation is one of the few U.S. organizations that point blank called for full privatization of Iraq's oil sector prior to the invasion of Iraq as a stated goal of the invasion. And to call point blank for full privatization, as I said, is truly radical. It's actually a shift for the Bush administration, which has for the past about 2 years been working on a more sort of privatization light agenda, putting forward what are called production sharing agreements in Iraq that would have the same outcome of privatization without calling it privatization. For the Iraq Study Group, which is supposed to be, you know, the meeting of the pragmatists, the sort of middle ground group that's going to help solve the war in Iraq, to put forward this incredibly radical proposal and to have nobody talk about it, to me is fairly shocking, and makes clear that still the Democrats, the Republicans, the media are afraid to talk about oil, but that oil, in my mind, still remains the linchpin for the administration and for all those in the oil sector in the United States. Baker and Eagleburger counted among them, for why U.S. troops are being committed and committed to stay. And the report says troops will stay until at least 2008. I think that is at a minimum to guarantee this oil access to U.S. Oil companies.
Former Secretary of State James Baker in 2003 went to Rome, Moscow, London, first official trip since he joined the Bush administration as a point person on issues around Iraq in 2003, but remained a senior partner in the law firm Baker Botts, which among others represents Halliburton as well as the Saudi government in the suit filed by family members who lost relatives in 9/11. Now, that's the family members who lost their loved ones versus the Saudi government, and he was representing the Saudi government.
Yeah, he's definitely had his allegiance spread, and it almost always, in the bottom line, has to do with oil. And as the public has been very clear in saying in its reports on Baker, or rather, excuse me, the media, that Baker is a pragmatist. He is a pragmatist. The Iraq Study Group report, page 1, chapter 1, says that the reason why Iraq is a critical country in the Middle East, in the world, and for the United States is because it has the second largest reserves of oil in the world.